This will be a high-level overview of objects to give you an introduction of common properties and how to make edits to them. Check out the object-specific lessons available for a detailed breakdown of each object. Often, the top 3 most used objects are images, text, and button objects. Let's compare those 3 objects' editors. What you see listed in each editor are properties. Remember, properties change the way an object or page looks in your app. You'll see these first 3 properties in every object editor: name, position and size, and angle. Also, this last property called visible is present in every object editor as well. Everything in between is unique to that object, though some objects will share other properties as well. For instance, see how the button and text objects have the same properties for style, font, color, and border? To edit any property, just tap on it to bring up the property pop-up. Sometimes the resulting pop-up will be one for you to type into, like this with the name property. Other times the pop-up will be interactive, like the position and size pop-up with sliders, or the angles pop-up with a dial, or the color property pop-ups that have a color palette. There's an advanced setting that we'll talk about soon. It's called raw values. It allows you to use text input for all the property pop-ups. Now let's compare the scripting tabs for each of these objects. When you first tap the scripting tab, you'll see that object's unique trigger or triggers. These are all the ways a user can directly interact with that specific object. Remember, the trigger is the event that tells an object to look for its set of instructions, which are called scripts. Some objects have a plus or minus sign with their list of triggers. These don't add or remove triggers, they're used for object-level subroutines, which we'll talk about in a bit. After clicking through any of the triggers in these objects, the Scripts tab will be identical, and you have the same script library available within any of them. We'll come back to this script library soon. As you become more familiar with each object's triggers, you'll find it useful to plan which object to use for a given purpose in your app. For instance, if you wanted a clickable image in your app, since the image object doesn't have a trigger for when it's touched, one approach would be to consider using a button object, configuring it to be transparent with no title or border, and then adding an image to its image property, so that way the button becomes a clickable image. There are a handful of objects that have sub-objects within them, like a collection object, for instance. It's made up of collection cells. Within the editor for objects like these, you'll see additional tabs and have multiple options for configuring properties or scripting. A few objects with sub-objects will also include a tab for data-driven capabilities. Let's start in the Properties tab of this collection object editor. This top-level Properties tab will control properties for the object at a high level, whereas clicking through to the Cells tab and into the collection cell number 1, there's additional properties to configure for an individual cell. Tapping the plus sign in the Cells tab, I can add as many cells as needed. Each of these will need their properties configured manually, so you could save time by perfecting cell number 1 and then cloning or copying it as needed. Note that there are 2 places for scripting as well. Within this collection cell number 1 tab, I can configure scripting for when cell is touched, and these scripts will apply only to collection cell number 1. Unless I clone or copy this cell, that same scripting will not be present within the other cells. To add scripts that do apply to all collection cells in this collection object, you would add scripting at the collection level instead of at the cell level. So note in this scripting tab, you'll see the trigger name here is default when cell is touched, instead of when cell is touched that we saw within the cell tab. Scripts added here will apply to all the cells in my collection object. It can be a bit time-consuming to add and manually configure every single cell in your collection object, and that's where data-driven capabilities come in. In the Data tab, I can select a dataset, configure the columns, and then you'll see that my collection object automatically displays that data in as many cells as are needed. Note that every cell then takes on the visual properties assigned to collection cell number 1, even if I had previously configured collection cell number 2, number 3, number 4, etc. This feature makes data-driven objects incredibly scalable. Check out other data-driven objects like the table object, selection wheel object, and the chart object. For further details on these and other objects in the Objects menu, check out our object-specific lessons. Now, it's time to jump into scripting. Next, we'll be looking at managing scripts.